The studio buzzed with electric anticipation. The crowd sat in dim lighting, murmuring, eyes locked on the grand red curtain. A heartbeat of silence stretched through the hall, and then, boom! The lights flared up, the show's theme music blasted through the speakers, and the name Victoria Lang Show gleamed across the massive LED screen. The audience erupted into cheers. A figure walked onto the stage, slow and calculated. Victoria Lang She wasn't just a talk show host, she was a storm in a tailored beige suit. Known for tearing down Hollywood's biggest names, she thrived on uncomfortable truths. Her sharp eyes scanned the room, a glint of something almost predatory flashing across her face. "Ladies and gentlemen," she purred, spreading her arms. "Tonight we have a reunion the world has been waiting for. Two legends, two Hollywood icons, finally, side by side again." A dramatic pause. "Please welcome Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock." The red curtain swept open, and the crowd lost it. Fans shot to their feet, some waving banners, others chanting their names. Keanu stepped out first, dressed in his signature all-black suit, calm and effortlessly composed. Sandra followed, radiating elegance in a navy blue dress. She blew a kiss to the audience, her smile warm. But there was something in her eyes, something guarded. They reached their seats, settling into the sleek modern chairs across from Victoria. The applause raged on, but Victoria let it stretch a little longer than needed. Let them bask in the warmth before she turned down the heat. Finally, she raised a hand, signaling the audience to settle. The atmosphere shifted. "So," she began, tapping her cue cards against her knee. "Keanu, Sandra, it's been years since you two shared a screen. Decades of success, challenges, and, of course," her lips curled at the edges, "controversies." Keanu remained still. Sandra's fingers brushed against the hem of her dress. A subtle move, but Victoria caught it. The audience went silent. Victoria leaned forward, her voice softer but carrying an unmistakable sharp edge. "Let's start with something simple." She tilted her head, eyes locked on them. "What does it mean to be Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock today?" Keanu blinked once, slow and thoughtful. Then he smiled faintly, leaning forward. But before he could answer, Victoria snapped her fingers. "Actually," she said, interrupting the moment, "scratch that. Let's cut the Hollywood fluff." Her voice hardened. "Do you really have control over your careers, or have you two just been puppets this whole time?" A sharp inhale rippled through the audience. Sandra's smile faltered, but only for a second. "Keanu?" He didn't move, but something in his eyes shifted, and that's when Victoria knew she had just stepped into dangerous territory. For a split second, silence stretched across the studio. The question hung in the air like a blade, sharp and waiting to cut. Sandra's fingers curled slightly against her lap. Keanu's expression didn't change, but there was something new in his stillness. Something unreadable. Victoria leaned in, sensing blood in the water. "I mean, let's be honest," she continued smoothly, twirling a pen between her fingers. "Hollywood is a machine, isn't it? You either play along, take the roles they give you, or you disappear." Keanu tilted his head, watching her. He didn't respond immediately, which only made the audience lean forward. Victoria smirked. "I mean, take you, Keanu, one of the biggest action stars of the 90s. But then, poof." She snapped her fingers. "You vanished for a while, only to resurface years later with John Wick. So tell me, was that your choice, or were you just waiting for someone to pull the strings again?" The audience murmured. It was an aggressive question, a direct challenge. A weaker guest might have stumbled, might have gotten defensive. Keanu only blinked. Then he exhaled softly, barely a sound, and spoke. "I think," he said, his voice even, "that in life, we all go through different phases. Some choices we make, some opportunities come our way, and sometimes," he paused, "we disappear to find ourselves." Sandra turned her head slightly toward him, watching his face. Victoria didn't flinch. She was ready for a vague, philosophical answer. "Right, right," she nodded, flipping through her cue cards dramatically. "And Sandra, what about you? Let's talk about your career." She let the pause stretch, long enough to make it uncomfortable. You were America's sweetheart, the queen of romantic comedies. But some would say you played it safe, never took the real risks, never went for the roles that could have made you. She gestured vaguely. One of the greats. Sandra's smile didn't fade, but her posture shifted ever so slightly. Victoria leaned in. Do you regret not taking bigger risks? The tension in the room was thick. The audience held their breath. The cameras zoomed in. Sandra finally exhaled softly, then let out a small, almost amused chuckle. You know, Victoria, she said, crossing one leg over the other. People think taking risks only means playing dark, tragic roles. But you know what I think? She tilted her head. Bringing joy to millions of people is the biggest risk an artist can take. The audience erupted in applause. Victoria's smirk flickered for half a second. Keanu glanced at Sandra, his lips curving just slightly. But Victoria wasn't done. She leaned forward, her eyes glinting. All right, she said, voice dropping. Let's really talk about honesty then. She turned to Keanu, her smile sharpening. Have you ever regretted a role you took? She asked. Then her voice softened just a fraction. Or a role you turned down. The crowd stilled. Sandra's fingers twitched against her lap because there was something in Victoria's tone, a trap. And Keanu? Keanu just watched her, unreadable as ever. Keanu didn't answer right away. He simply looked at Victoria, his expression as steady as ever. But the silence wasn't empty. It was loaded. The kind of pause that pulled the entire room into it. The audience, the crew, even Sandra, everyone was waiting for his response. Victoria knew she had struck a nerve. She leaned forward just a little, like a predator sensing hesitation. Come on, Keanu, she pressed, her voice smooth, controlled. You've been in this business long enough to know how things work. There has to be something you regret. Maybe a movie you took just for the paycheck? Maybe something you passed on, thinking it wouldn't be a hit? Sandra's jaw tightened slightly, but she didn't speak. Keanu exhaled slowly through his nose. Then finally, he spoke. Regret, he said, his voice low but firm, is just a story we tell ourselves about the past. The words landed like a slow-moving wave, rippling through the silence. Victoria arched an eyebrow. That's a nice quote, she said, amused, but I'm asking for specifics. Keanu tilted his head, and for the first time there was something behind his eyes. Not anger, not irritation, just something deeper. Every choice I've made, he said, led me to this moment. If I regretted any of them, I wouldn't be here. The way he said it, measured, unwavering, made Victoria pause. She didn't like losing control of the conversation. She needed something sharper, more personal. She turned to Sandra. And you? She asked, voice dropping just slightly. Have you ever regretted something you accepted or something you turned down? Sandra's smile was still there, but it was thinner now. Keanu turned his head toward her, subtle, protective. I think, Sandra said after a moment, that regret is a privilege. It means you had choices. She let that sit for a second before adding, not everyone does. Victoria studied her carefully. She could tell Sandra wasn't going to crack, so she changed her approach. You've played so many roles about love, she mused, but in real life, you've never found someone to truly stay by your side. Why? The room went dead silent. Sandra blinked once, just once. Victoria tilted her head, waiting. Keanu's jaw clenched. The audience felt it, the shift in energy, the way the air got heavier. Sandra inhaled slowly. When she exhaled, she let out a soft, unexpected laugh. Not nervous, not amused, something else. You know, Victoria, she said, her voice even, there are some questions that say more about the person asking than the person answering. Victoria's smirk faltered. Sandra leaned back slightly, crossing her legs. I did find someone, she said, her tone lighter now, but her eyes weren't. Someone who loved me exactly as I am, who made me laugh, who gave me a family. The audience was silent, completely, utterly still. Sandra's voice softened. "And he's gone." Victoria froze. Keanu turned his head toward Sandra, slow, deliberate. His eyes held something rare, something personal. For the first time that night, Victoria Lang had miscalculated, and she knew it. For a moment, Victoria said nothing. The weight of Sandra's words had shifted the entire room. The audience, once eager for the tension, now sat frozen in stunned silence. Even the camera crew, seasoned professionals, hesitated. Sandra didn't look away. She didn't blink. She let Victoria feel the full weight of what she had just asked. Victoria, to her credit, was quick to recover. She had built her career on controlling the narrative, and she wasn't about to lose grip now. She adjusted the cue cards in her hand as if recalibrating. "I see," she murmured, nodding slowly. "That must have been difficult." Keanu exhaled softly, just enough for Sandra to hear. A silent, "I'm here." Victoria wasn't done. If she couldn't break Sandra, she'd turn her attention elsewhere. She set her cards down and leaned forward. "Keanu," she said, voice dipping into something almost too gentle. "Your life has been marked by public tragedies. You've lost people. You've faced difficult times, and yet..." Her gaze sharpened. "You always appear untouchable." Keanu's fingers interlaced on his lap. "The world sees you as this modern-day monk," Victoria continued, pressing her advantage. "A man who never loses his temper, who never lets people see him break." Her head tilted as if she had just thought of something. "Or maybe," she mused, "maybe that's just a carefully constructed image." The air changed. Sandra shifted in her seat. The audience barely breathed. Keanu finally moved, just a little. He leaned back, stretching his legs slightly, as if giving himself more space. But his eyes, they never left Victoria's. She had expected him to deflect, to stay calm, philosophical, unreadable. Instead, he smiled. Not a nervous smile, not forced, not even amused, a genuine, quiet, almost knowing smile. "I see," he said, mirroring her tone. Victoria's confidence wavered just a fraction. "So," she said, regaining her footing, "what's your answer, Keanu?" He exhaled softly, leaning forward just a little. "If I were playing a character, Victoria," he said, voice even, "I think I'd be doing a terrible job of it." A ripple of nervous laughter stirred in the audience. Victoria's grip on her cue cards tightened. She hadn't expected that. Keanu continued, his tone never shifting. "Because the truth is," he shrugged slightly, "I'm just a guy who makes mistakes, a guy who has regrets, a guy who has moments of anger, sadness, frustration." He paused, "Just like anyone else." The audience stilled. Sandra watched him, something unreadable in her gaze. Victoria hesitated, just for a second. Keanu turned his head slightly, looking toward the crowd now. "The difference is," he said, "I've never felt the need to broadcast those moments, to prove I'm human." Silence. Then applause. Not polite applause. Not forced. Real. Victoria pressed her lips together. She had lost this round, but she wasn't done yet. She straightened in her seat, picked up a new cue card, and looked directly at Keanu. "There's something," she said, voice dropping into something almost theatrical, "that you've never spoken about in public." Keanu didn't move. Victoria's eyes gleamed. "Something," she continued, "that could change the way everyone here sees you." Sandra tensed. The audience leaned in. Victoria's smile sharpened. "Are you ready," she asked, "to finally reveal the truth?" And just like that, the game had changed again. The room felt heavier now. Not with silence, but with something unspoken, something that had weight. Keanu didn't blink, didn't shift, didn't even breathe differently. Sandra, however, subtly tensed beside him. Victoria had played her card. She had pushed all her chips to the center of the table. Now she just had to see if Keanu would fold. The audience leaned in. Keanu tilted his head slightly. "What truth?" he asked, his voice impossibly calm. "Are you referring to Victoria?" It was such a simple response, but it shifted the energy, putting the pressure back on her. Now she had to make the next move. She had to be the one to reveal what she was trying to expose. Victoria hesitated for just a fraction of a second. Then she leaned forward, her voice lowering. "For decades," she said, "people have admired you for your resilience, your kindness, your ability to stay humble in an industry that destroys people." Keanu remained still. "But many," she continued, tilting her head, "also wonder how much of that is real." Sandra inhaled sharply. The audience rippled with murmurs. Victoria pressed on. "How much of Keanu Reeves is a persona, a carefully crafted image of a man who never loses his temper, who never makes mistakes, who is always the good guy?" The crowd shifted. It wasn't the personal bombshell they were expecting, but it was just as dangerous. Sandra narrowed her eyes slightly. She saw what Victoria was doing. This wasn't about exposing a scandal. This was about dismantling Keanu's identity. The Keanu the world loved, the Keanu people believed in. For a moment no one spoke. Then Keanu moved. Not much, just a slight shift. But then he did something that made the entire room freeze. He smiled, not a forced smile, not a nervous one, a real, quiet, almost amused smile. Sandra blinked. Victoria's smirk faltered. Keanu exhaled, leaning back in his chair, stretching his legs out slightly. Then, in a voice just as controlled, just as measured, he spoke. "I get it," he said. Victoria arched an eyebrow. "Oh?" Keanu nodded. "You were hoping for something bigger, some deep, dark confession." He let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head slightly. "That's the thing, though." He looked at her now, really looked at her. "People don't remember us for the roles we play in movies, Victoria." He tilted his head. "They remember us for the role we play in their lives." The audience gasped. Sandra's lips parted slightly. "Victoria?" She actually looked stunned, because Keanu hadn't just answered her question. He had ended the conversation, and the audience knew it. They exploded into applause. Victoria sat back, cue card still in hand, fingers gripping the edges. She had lost control. Sandra saw it. Keanu saw it. And Victoria? She felt it, but she wasn't ready to let go yet. She picked up her final card. Her expression shifted. Her voice lowered. "If that's true, Keanu," she said carefully, "then tell me this." She looked up, eyes locked on him. "Do you ever wonder," she asked, "if the world will one day forget you?" And just like that, the energy changed again. The question landed like a sharp knife, slicing through the applause, through the moment of victory. The audience, still buzzing from Keanu's last response, froze. Forget him? Keanu's gaze didn't waver, but Sandra turned her head toward him, eyes flickering with something unreadable. Victoria had played her final card, not a scandal, not an attack, something worse, a seed of doubt. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. It was the kind of question that lived in the back of every star's mind, the kind they never said out loud. Keanu leaned forward slightly, not defensive, just thoughtful. His fingers tapped lightly against his knee. Victoria waited. Then, finally, Keanu exhaled softly and spoke. "Everyone gets forgotten eventually, Victoria." The studio fell completely silent. Victoria's smirk flickered. Just for a second. Keanu kept his voice steady, but there was something deeper in it now. Something that made even the audience lean in. "That's life," he continued. "The world keeps moving. New faces, new stories." He paused. "We all fade away." Sandra stilled. Victoria narrowed her eyes. "So, you do fear it?" Keanu let out the softest chuckle. "No," he said simply. Victoria blinked. "No?" Keanu shook his head. "Because people don't remember what you did." He glanced at the audience, his voice quieter now, more personal. "They remember how you made them feel. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. And then, the audience erupted. Not just applause, a standing ovation. Sandra turned toward him, and for the first time that night she smiled. Not for the cameras, not for the show. A real, private smile. Victoria had nothing left to say. She forced a small, tight-lipped smile, picking up her cue cards. "Well," she said over the roaring applause, "this has certainly been a revealing conversation." She turned to the cameras, her voice shifting into closing mode. Keanu Reeves, Sandra Bullock. Two legends, still standing, still inspiring. And, as we've seen tonight, still full of surprises. The cheers only grew louder. The cameras cut. The show was over. But Victoria knew the truth. She had tried to control this interview, to push Keanu and Sandra into her game. Instead, they had turned the tables on her. And as Keanu and Sandra walked off that stage side by side, one thing was clear. Legends don't fade, they become immortal.